Welcome to Incognito, the podcast, where I converse with interesting guests from a variety of fields and disciplines about how they foster inclusive workplaces and communities. If we were to use the simple and often used phrase, music is a universal language, today's guest would suggest that it goes even beyond that. Ronnie is an international musician. We spoke while he was in Qatar playing music at events surrounding the World Cup, and he truly embodies a sense of worldliness in the way he creates openings for connections. Whether it is his Palestinian roots, his Muslim faith, or his Arabic language, he finds ways to make connections far and wide. We discussed how those identifiers can be both an obstacle and a way in, as well as how fear of confronting our own ignorance can dictate the choices people make in distancing themselves. And he relates a wonderful story about using music and culture to create a bridge in small-town America. Welcome to Incognito, the podcast. I'm your host, Michael Fosberg, and with me today is Ronnie Malley. Malley is a multi-instrumentalist musician, composer, sound designer, actor, playwright, producer, educator, and executive director of Intercultural Music Production. He has worked on award-winning theatrical plays and films, recorded as a musician on over 20 albums, and performed with several ensembles of various global music styles, including Alos Musica, Apollo's Fire, Diwan Alhan, M.A., Lama Jamal, Newberry Consort, Subari Ensemble, University of Chicago Middle East Music Ensemble, and Yves Francois and Rocambo Jazz. Ronnie has a BA in Global Music Studies from DePaul University and specializes in music of the Middle East, North Africa, India, and medieval Spain. He is also currently pursuing a graduate degree at the University of Chicago. Ronnie, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you.
Thank you, Michael. It's so good to be here. I appreciate it.
I have to say, how do you have time to do all of this? He's currently pursuing a graduate degree. I was like, my gosh, I don't know how. And you're joining us from Qatar right now. So
I am, yes.
You've got a lot going on, my friend, a lot going on. And I want to talk about that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you having me on the show. I get asked that question a lot. How do you have time for all this? And, it's just kind of one of those things where things are iterative, where you do one thing and it leads to another and they become kind of one thing together.
Yes.
And even the pursuit of graduate studies, I just kind of looked back at it and thought, here I am gaining all of these experiences and doing all kinds of things, with the blessings of the universe and the grace of others. And I thought, well, what's a way I can really give back with this? And I thought I need to find a way to formalize and document this, which is really what led to school, because it's not something separate. It's really about everything I do. I try to incorporate research into it. I try to incorporate learning something from it and being able to give that back to the world. And so if I can do that through an academic sense and still kind of continue to do what I do, it's been very helpful. And that's really kind of what led to going to do that. It's about loving what you do, I suppose, and trying to make the time for that.
Yeah.
Do I always have the time? No.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about, because this, I talk about this with each of my guests. This is a very impressive bio. And as you've just laid out, there's lots of things going on, or lots of moving parts that you're always trying to learn and grow and then share that with the world. But I want to know a little bit more, and perhaps listeners would like to learn more about, like, how do you see yourself in the world? Like, what are the identities that are core to how you see yourself?
Well, not in any particular order,
Yeah.
but first and foremost, I'm blessed to be a father of two girls. I'm a husband. I'm an artist, an educator. My ethnic identity is I'm Palestinian American, born first generation Palestinian American. My mother is from Jerusalem and my father is from a little town near Ramallah in the West Bank. I grew up in a Muslim household. I don't know, as a person, I just try to see myself as being a person of good conscience. more than anything. I try not to wear what things I've been born into by circumstance on my sleeve,
Yeah.
and just realize that here we are in the world, together, all of us sharing this bubble, and let's make the best of the time that we have.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Bearing with all of that in mind, have you ever felt walking into a room that those identities, one, all, a few, whatever, might have been an obstacle?
I did say I'm Palestinian, I'm Arab and Muslim. So pick one of them.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Yeah, all three, really. Ironically, sometimes it's happened, if people know I'm Muslim, it's not like I'm the most devout person or going in there, but that's
Yeah.
that's my religious background. But I've learned to accept many other religions. I've studied everything from Hinduism. I've been in Christian churches of many denominations. I've performed in synagogues, Hindu temples.
Mm.
So, I mean, for me, it's all one thing. But if I said, what I was and what I grew up with, it would be Islam. Sometimes it happens for being Arab,
Hmm.
because some people don't really know what that means, and even some Arabs don't know what that means necessarily. And definitely sometimes for being Palestinian, depending on where I go, and just sometimes even saying that is a political statement to some.
Sure.
Uh, and the irony too is sometimes I've actually also gotten it from saying that I'm American. Going abroad or visiting other places, they almost want to pigeonhole me into these other things, and I found difficulty or an obstacle for being American. So it's a double-edged sword in some ways, but it's
Wow.
it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. And I'm curious because you work with so many different musical cultures, shall we say. Is there a dynamic in that that presents some obstacles sometimes? Because, as you've just said, Muslim, Palestinian, Arab, you're working with other cultural musicians. Does that sometimes present itself as an obstacle?
Sometimes it's an obstacle, sometimes it's an absolute way in, because it's interesting in America, how cultures view each other here. A lot of times we put the American first, and everything else is kind of like, I don't
Yeah,
want to say secondary, but an adjunct to that, if you will.
sure.
Whereas if you go to other places, they already have some of their own, I don't want to use the word pejoratively, but stereotypes or their own ideas about something. For example, when I go to Spain and I sit in with a flamenco group, the
Mm.
moment they know that I'm Middle Eastern, it's a nostalgic thing for them. They're like, "Oh, like the origins of this music," kind of vibe. When I go to places like India, it's got a similar kind of. It's kind of like a way in, a foot in the door in some ways, because I have this culture behind me, which is my own culture. And in some ways, I've been able, as an American, to objectively view my own culture as well, because it's a dichotomy, being American, but also being this other thing. Because I grew up at home speaking primarily Arabic.
Wow.
I grew up with my grandparents, and that was the main language. But with my father, who's a musician as well, I spoke a lot of English. But my mother is 100% Arabic. So I really did grow up with that programming, if you will. And so when I go to other places, it does help me. Like in India, I can find the similarities in those cultures. We find our commonalities, even though there's some subtle differences. And it's been helpful in that regard.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Sometimes, though, and I won't name a particular culture, there's a rift between Arab culture
Sure.
and another culture, and their prejudices can come out as well,
Yeah.
where you can kind of sense it. Yet, at one time I was actually recording something. I was recording some Hindu spiritual music because I have a recording studio,
Hmm.
and the gentleman said this just kind of out of innocence, or, it's kind of innocuous to him, but he didn't realize it. He said he's recording Hindu spiritual songs. And there's this political rift that's happening in India between Muslims and Hindus.
Mm.
And he said, "Where are you from, Ronnie? And what's your background?" Because he saw some kind of thing at the house that said Allah or something on it like that. It was just like this thing I had. He said, "You're a Muslim." He's like, "I wish all Muslims were like you."
Yeah.
I thought, well, I just not. How do I respond to that? I wish all Hindus were. It's an important thing to know, not to generalize about people, because there's good, bad, and different, all kinds of people in this world, regardless of what their background is.
Right. We're not a monolith. I often
Not at
confront,
all.
yeah, I often challenge groups that I'm working with, and I'll ask them the question, what does it mean to be an American? And if you ask that question to a dozen people, you'll get a dozen different answers. And you kind of
Absolutely.
alluded to it earlier when you talked about Arab, being an Arab, and that's a lot of different things and seen by a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. And so I totally get that. I was brought up in an Armenian household, and so there was a great deal of what shall we call it, resentment, I guess, to not use a stronger word, towards Turkish people, of
Sure.
course. And so I was brought up with that, and of course, labeling them all with one thing doesn't speak to the multitude of different people, different types of Turkish people there are. So, yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
You know exactly what I was saying. And it's funny being on the other side and witnessing those things, working with cultures, either between Turks and Greeks, or Armenians, or Indians and Pakistanis, or,
Yeah.
or Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Arabs, and
Yeah.
Palestinians. It's an interesting dynamic.
Sure. I wonder if you could share with listeners perhaps a challenging situation that required some unifying efforts on your part, and how you overcame that challenge of difference or culture, perhaps.
In terms of a cultural thing, I always recollect something that happened in 2016. I was on tour with a program called Caravan Sarai. And this is a series that was put together by Arts Midwest, which is a huge arts organization in the
I'm very
Midwest.
familiar with it. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so they had this program funded by the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. And the program, called Caravan Sarai, would bring artists from the Muslim and Muslim adjacent world. And they weren't all necessarily Muslim, it's just they happened to come from predominantly Muslim countries, to Middle America, to cities that probably never saw a Muslim person, let alone brown people, except on television or in the news. And so that's what the program would do. And it would put them there for a residency for a week in these small little towns, just to create a bridge building type of residency program.
Yes.
Well, the year that I did it happened to be the last year, and they wanted to get some artists from here in America. And they happened to choose me and another friend, Indian American friend of mine. His name is Zishan Bagwadi. And he's a brilliant musician, trained in classical opera, but he also sings qawwali and ghazal and like Islamic hymns and these kinds of things.
Wow.
But he's also a huge fan of R&B and soul. And I, growing up American, was also a huge fan of rock and roll. I had a healthy dose of rock and roll from my cousins. And so I grew up playing everything from Guns N' Roses to Iron Maiden to Judas Priest, Metallica. But my father, all of that stuff. But my father, made sure we listened and played a lot of Egyptian music and this sort of thing. So this particular tour was called Caravan Sarai, Muslim American Voices. And so we went in and we said, what are we going to present? And I thought, you know what? I have a lot of the Sufi poetry, Sufi Islamic poetry, like Rumi, Sohrawardi, Hafiz, from medieval Islamic era, that I took and turned into rock songs. And so it was kind of like Sufi rock, if you will.
Oh, wow.
And Zishan, my friend, had some songs that he put together that were, kind of like R&B style, but he's singing them in Urdu. And so we walked into the first town. We went to 3 towns in Middle America, if you will. We went to Grand Forks, North Dakota,
Oh my God.
Fergus Falls, Minnesota, and
Yes.
Traverse City, Michigan, which wasn't so bad either.
Okay.
But Fergus Falls definitely being one of those places, smack dab in the middle of, basically Leave It to Beaver, and
Yeah. Yeah. Middle of nowhere. Yeah.
really it was. And we were probably some of the only people of color in this town, except for maybe a few actually Native Americans that we saw there,
Mhm.
not too far, but that was about it. And in these residencies, they're 1 week long. So we're holed up in a hotel, and our goal is that we're supposed to go visit some schools to give some workshops and these sorts of things. And we're supposed to also kind of go out into the community and meet people in the community. So one of the first things that we had to do as soon as we checked in was to go to like a Chamber of Commerce meeting that they had in our honor there. So as Zishan and I, we kind of walked into this meeting, and we're setting up, and we're about to kind of just meet and greet everybody and just do a small, quick performance of sorts. Within earshot, this guy just kind of comes in and just makes sure we hear it. He's like, so this is what terrorist music sounds like, huh?
Oh my God.
And we just kind of looked at each other. He didn't realize we heard him. He wasn't addressing us per se. And we just thought, okay, are
Yeah.
we safe here?
Yeah.
It didn't help that the town that we were just in before we got there had experienced a hate crime. Somebody had burned down a Somali mosque. This is all 2016, mind you.
Wow.
February 2016, after a certain former president had made their
Announcement.
announcement
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
all of the, and so it definitely, we were seeing the effects of that. So we felt like we were literally on the front lines of this. And so, I mean, we want to talk about challenging. How do you challenge somebody that just said, you're
Yeah.
going to play
Yeah.
terrorist music? And so when we kind of started, it's not like their hearts were already, ready open to accept us. But, it did temper things a little bit. We're speaking, English. We're not like these, we're from like couple cities just south of them, I mean,
A few miles
Chicago
south.
and Milwaukee,
Right.
you
Right.
know? And so that passed. And then we just thought, okay, you know what? We're going to be proactive about this. So Zishan and I went out. We went to the cafe. We even got haircuts there. We went and visited all the restaurants. We made sure to talk to people and just kind of build this up.
Mm.
And the gentleman that was helping with us with all of this, God bless him. He's an amazing gentleman. Michael, another Michael, by the way. Gosh, forgive me, I forgot his last name. I'll have to find it at some point.
Okay.
But what an amazing person. And he came and was very candid with us. He said, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm having a little bit of trouble with our committee here. And I thought, what's that? Because we were scheduled to go to a school like the next day. And he said, one of the people came in, apparently a petition had been circling, that they were trying to petition us from preventing us from going into the schools to give workshops.
Wow.
They thought we were there to proselytize.
Wow.
And we're like, we're Midwestern kids here. It just happens to be our background is, Muslim. What?
Yeah.
Why? And so he said, I fought them on this. And I said, we're paying this money. This is the grant. And these are the stipulations of the grant. They're going into the schools. And so we did. We went to school, and there was definitely some reluctance. And you can tell on whose part, because they were coming in, piecemeal.
Yeah.
So one group would come in, and apparently they had some refugees there and some young ladies who were wearing hijab, and that was like it in the front row. We thought, all right, well, this is wonderful that they're here, but is
Yeah.
this all who we're playing for? Where's the school or the students? And then some of the music instructors brought their classes in. And as they brought their classes in, we're like, here, I'm going to show you a little bit about my instrument, my culture, but here's something of my culture too. And I would play Metallica, Enter Sandman.
Yes. Yes.
And immediately that was like the icebreaker right away.
Wow.
Not to mention the music that we were playing as well, which was, it's this fusion of rock and roll and R&B. We completely annihilated any any misconceived notions that they have about us or the stereotypes that they were expecting.
Yeah.
You know, some people, not to make this about this, but, you know, some people were in their minds, in their imaginations, expecting us to sit there and play for snakes and baskets, you know? That was like what we were getting from some
Yeah,
folks.
right. The stereotypes.
But we went out into the cafes. We held a an open mic jam where we invited musicians to come and join us. We did that. We went to a Kiwanis Club meeting
Oh my God.
as well. And Zishan, who's got this operatic belting voice, has sang the Star Spangled Banner in Wrigley Field before.
Oh my
He
gosh.
goes in, and we're celebrating the veterans, and he goes into a rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. And here I'm playing, you know, Middle Eastern instrument behind him. And we just shared stories that, you know, my entire family has been in America since 1893. You know, my I have family members who have been here since then,
Yeah.
and many of them have been in the service since World War One, World War Two, Korean War, Vietnam. I
Mm.
mean, we're as American as you can be, but we still maintained our own tradition as well.
Yeah.
And so, you know, by the end of the week, because that was the culminating event, the culminating concert, we had done all of this like bridge building work. Like,
Yeah.
it wasn't easy, as you can imagine, and the turnout was remarkable. The place was full.
That's amazing.
And then there were some families that we didn't even know who were Middle Eastern who came to us afterwards and said, "This is the first time we feel like we can come out in public and we felt like ourselves."
Wow.
And if it was just for them that we did it, it was well worth it.
You,
And
yes. Yeah, you
it,
broke
it
down the
was
barriers.
it was totally that. I couldn't imagine any other way to say it, you know, other than that.
You know, I don't want to assume this, but I actually, in leading up to our conversation today, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, talking with you and just about this thing that, I don't know, many people have probably heard about music being a universal language.
Mhm.
And I think in many ways that story epitomizes the universal language of music, whether you were, I mean, you obviously used some music, let's say Metallica, to break the ice, but that enabled you and others to then go into your cultural music, which allowed people to soften up their stereotypical beliefs, I'm assuming, yes?
Absolutely, absolutely. Music, it does carry. You know, it's easy to call it a universal language,
Yeah,
which it sound, I would say, is for me, I would say sound is universal
yes.
because we all experience sound. Even if you don't hear, you're experiencing sound just by mere virtue of the earth revolving. Okay. uh I mean, and waves in the air, and looking at music in such a way. But actual music, and then digging deep into researching or studying a particular song, like you mentioned Armenian. I remember playing one time an Armenian song in Paris, France. I was living out there at the time, and I was doing this library gig. Funny enough, for a friend who couldn't do it, and he said, "Can you please take my place?" And I went and I just kind of put together a quick repertoire. One of the pieces was an Armenian piece. The other was a Rebettica piece from Greece. And a bunch of these people came, and this woman came up to me afterwards, just tears.
Yeah.
And she said, You know, you were playing this music of my heritage, and I haven't heard this since my father." And it just brought back a flood of memories to
Um,
her. And I thought, wow, that's very powerful.
yeah.
Uh, how can we do that? How can we utilize this? How can I do music? Because this was at a time in 2005, something like that, where I was in transition, leaving the corporate world,
Oh,
and I worked, you know, as a real estate appraiser, as a banker, as a business owner, retail management. I did a lot of businessy things, if you will.
okay.
Um, but music was, you know, my life all this time. We had a family band growing up, but that experience in that particular moment too, I want to say, was, you know, was kind of like a catalyst. It was an eye-opening experience to realize, wow, you know, I can really use this in more than just the capacity of entertainment. This has more than just entertainment value to it. If we can move somebody to tears with nostalgia with this song and talk about it, it opens up a conversation. It opens up a conversation of what it means to that person, but also what it might mean to a greater subject.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say, in my own work, in my solo show, my autobiographical play, I don't actually talk about my Armenian roots that much. There's just a slight mention of it in there, but whenever there's an Armenian in the audience, it brings them right to me after the show. They're like right on it, because Armenians are, that's the way they are. When they hear about themselves or music or whatever, they're right there. They're all over it. So it really connects people. And there's a little story in my book about growing up with Armenian meals and having these rich Armenian meals. I describe the food, I describe the whole setting, and all these people coming up and learn and discovering new relatives. Every time I went to an Armenian picnic, I discovered new relatives. I had more relatives. And one of the things that is so interesting is that it just really resonated with people. When I read that story aloud once, it resonated with people from all different nationalities. Jewish people came up to me, Bulgarian people came up to me and said, "Oh, it sounds like my family." And there's such a commonality in that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's something to it. I think the arts in general, whether it's music or whether, it's funny. I wrote a play as well that was a solo play that was semi-autobiographical. Because I had written it initially at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival about this historic figure from the 9th century who took the oud, the instrument I play, which became the lute, to Cordoba, Spain, and et cetera. And I presented it to Silk Road Rising Theater, who wanted to produce it as part of their solo series.
Yeah.
And
I think we discussed it at one point.
I think so.
We did. We talked about this one time. Yeah.
And they said, this is great, but can you put a little bit of yourself in it? I thought, myself? Okay. And so I had to really go back, and it was a wonderful iterative process. It was a wonderful kind of like cyclical process to come back to it and realize, okay, well, where are we? What are the things that are overlapping here about this 9th century musician who's kind of exiled and goes to this other place? And I thought to myself, well, my grandmother told me a plethora of stories growing up about living in Jerusalem before 1948, and just living, in the buildings that we had. We had a few buildings there in West Jerusalem, which is today predominantly Jewish. But she would tell me about the neighbors being Jewish, Christian, Muslim. The rabbi who lived across the hall from them his children used to call my great grandfather Baba. Like it was a camaraderie. People were concerned with being just good people, not necessarily good hyphenate, whatever. And so I put a lot of that story in there, and I thought, well, that kind of overlaps over here too. What's it like to be American? What is it like to live in America with this plethora of diversity here, and
Right.
how can we do that? And and a lot of people came after that. They were very moved by the power of the word, the power of artistic representation, that they might see themselves in something that they might resonate with. It's powerful, and it makes me look back and realize that nobody's going to remember me for the last real estate appraisal I did. they're gonna remember the moment that they came and spent at Silk Road Rising Theater about this story that moved them, or about this piece of music that touched their hearts.
Right. So along that lines, then, is there one thing that you could recommend to listeners that could act as a catalyst for a more inclusive society, or perhaps an inclusive workplace? I mean, it could be a lesson, a tool, a step, a rule, a story.
Something I tell a lot of my students who are learning to play an instrument or an oud or something, or any instrument for that matter, is I often tell them, and maybe I'm biased or partial to this, but I'll say, learn some of the language. Go and learn some of that language. And learn about each other. I think the first thing that creates division is fear, and that fear of the other is not fear from the other, but rather fear about confronting our own ignorance about the other. And so if we really kind of get to know each other, we're going to find so many similarities, whether it's like, learn a language or learn to cook somebody else's cuisine or appreciate their music or their literature or whatever it might be. And in those differences that we find, we might actually find our commonalities.
Right.
Uh, because, every culture has writing, has books, has some kind of artistic expression. So there's the common ground right there. What's the context and what's the content of those things? Well, that might differ, but it gives us an insight into at least being able to learn about each other in that way.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. That's just beautiful. So let me ask you about, well, particular words. We all perceive definitions to words just slightly differently. Everybody, like I mentioned earlier, if I asked, what is an American, we'd have like a dozen different answers, a dozen different people. And of course, we have our own set of biases that we come to the table with. But if I were to ask you what it means to be authentic, how would you describe that? And what does that look like for you?
That has changed over many years,
That's
about what that really means. And I guess, it's funny, that word is unique because it's been a way for me to create benchmarks about my own life and experiences in life. If you had asked me that question maybe 20 years ago in the music world that I was in, and, I'd have said, it's got to be just this way, only with these instruments and whatnot. But as we change and we grow and we change and grow more, I've learned to come over the years to realize that authentic is not about being purist. It's about being sincere. If you sincerely are approaching something, whether it's your own culture or somebody else's culture, and it's a tradition, know it. It doesn't mean that it's not going to grow, because nothing, human beings are obviously still around on this planet. So we're not fossilized into anything per se. You can remain within a particular tradition or context of it. I mean, I know people who play purely traditional music, yet, will go off and they'll do electronic music, or they have a rock band, myself included. It's funny because the reason I'm here in Qatar right now is kind of this fusion. I have this knowledge of tradition in me of playing the oud, a classical Middle Eastern instrument, and all of this music. And I'm working here with a Syrian hip hop artist whose name is Omar Offendem. And together we created this project called Little Syria, along with another friend of ours, Joseph Hamoui. And Little Syria is actually about the New York neighborhood of Little Syria, where today is Wall Street. And it talks about the wave of immigrants that came in the late 19th century to New York and established a neighborhood. And back in those times, Syrian meant anybody who was Lebanese, Palestinian, or Syrian, as we know today, because it was under Ottoman rule. And what was very interesting about that is this is particularly the time where Khalil Gibran was part of what they call the Pen League, and many of the writers from there who wrote in Arabic and English. And so we revive them and resurrect their spirits and essence in this play that we put together. But what's interesting is that Omar is not only a poet, he's a rapper. And Joey is a hip hop producer. But I'm bringing in this cultural element of tradition.
Right.
And so we're finding ways to really blend those things together, particularly to give reverence to this time, but in a modern kind of way. And in many ways, this is how I've kind of lived my life. I feel though the sincerity part is what's really more important. If you're sincere about wanting to learn about another culture, sit with somebody else, sit with their culture, even your own, and learn the things beyond just some food, but learn something deep about that culture, something beyond the surface. Penetrate the surface a little bit, and you'll see the essence of what that is. Once you have that, that doesn't mean you have to stay there. That doesn't mean that, I talk to folks here, even people who are of Arab descent in Chicago, for example. And, some of them have come in the 60s, some came in the 70s, some came later. And whenever they came here, they kind of stayed in that, what they brought with them, they kind of secured it so that they can remain with them. But they don't realize sometimes too that, well, if you go back home overseas right now, it's 2022. It's not 1967. Right. And so they too have advanced and they've progressed. So it's really important to keep those things in mind, because authentic and tradition, it's an organic thing.
That's beautiful. That's great. That's a great place to end this off. Thank you so much for that. I want to ask you one final thing, which is, could you recommend a book, a movie, a play, or some music, or something that has inspired you recently, and why?
Boy, that's interesting. The list is long.
Long, I'm sure. Yes.
Yeah, a long time ago, when I made this transition, it was Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist. Something a little, obviously, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet was a huge influence on my life as well. Another great book was the Mysticism of Sound and Music by Inayat Khan. And this is a book of lectures by somebody who was a Sufi musician from India, and just every little note was a nugget of wisdom that you just needed to meditate on. But one I read more recently that influenced even my master's thesis was called Ornament of the World by Maria Rosa Menocal. And she talks about medieval Andalusia and the coexistence that was between Jews, Christians, and Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula. And this is a golden era between about the 9th century to the 15th century. And what is in it, for me, almost satisfied the omission of history that I grew up with in the education system here in America. Yeah. It filled a void and gaps that propelled me even now to move on into graduate school to actually study and write about this. And so I would say that was probably one of the most influential and inspiring books, because she wrote it just after 9/11, a few years after, to talk about what it means to coexist. And convivencia is the actual term that they use in sociology. And it's very interesting, because we see the juxtaposition between, what happened in this medieval era of 7 centuries, when the Iberian Peninsula not only spoke Arabic, but also had this interesting symbiotic relationship between Jews and Arabs and Jews and Muslims, that they elevated each other's status, that Arabic influenced the revival of Hebrew to be written as a poetic language. And they call this in Hebrew the golden age of Hebrew poetry, because a lot of the hymns that they call piyutim actually come from this particular era. I can wax poetic about Under the Sea forever. But that book was really a game changer, I would say. And the other book that I could say was Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers.
Ah, yes. Great book.
That was a great book. Yeah. Really, really good book. So there's a few of them.
Okay. All right. Ronnie, this has been wonderful. Shukran.
Have fun. Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate it.
Thanks again for listening to Incognito the Podcast, Season 3. If you're a new listener, welcome. I hope you found something here that you can use in your work life or your community. And if you are returning, I'm really happy to continue to have your support. As always, we welcome your suggestions and encourage you to rate and comment in your podcast app. Ratings and comments help people find us and allows us to spread the word about this work. Also, you can find us on Instagram at Incognito the Play. Find us there, follow us, and hit us up with a question or comment. Look, we have limited social media presence, so I'm also urging you to take an additional step to tell someone you know about this work. I'll be back again next week with yet another conversation that delves deeply into identity, authenticity, and ways in which we can create inclusive communities and workspaces. If you've noticed, we're doing something a little bit different this week. At the top of the podcast, in transitions, we've got some of Ronnie's music playing, and we're going to leave you with a track here at the end, so enjoy.